Thank you, Mark. Okay, so now we're going to have some questions for the panel. I'm just going to move my chair forward so I can see everybody. As in previous sessions, you can use SMS. So it's, well, I think you know about it. It's 0427 541 357 and SMS GC 2017, 2017, obviously, and also Twitter hashtag Green Cities. Obviously, there's going to be some roving mics, so let's have some questions. But first off, to you, Andrew. You can't. Thanks, mate. No worries. Well, he's the foreigner, so we've got to bring him on board. But if you know, you've been here. We had a chat before we came on. You've been here about 5 years ago, and then you're back. When you hear the kind of things that we're all talking about here, that there's been some resistance to this idea of density, but then there seems to be, after listening to the speakers, there's great hope. So when you look at Australia from your perspective, have you gone through the same trials and tribulations, or are we different, or we're the same? What do you think?
I think we're going through them ourselves. You know, we're going through these same density arguments in the UK. At the moment we have, around London, we have a green belt, which is kind of sacrosanct in planning terms, and we can't build on that green belt. And at the moment, that's being questioned as to whether we should be building on that green belt. But at the same time, the density of London is still half that of Paris. So there's no, you know, so these are the arguments that are very current in London. You know, the density of Sydney surely is a lot less than London, but I think that there are, you know, you can see that from cities like, you know, you don't have to go even to Beijing or to Hong Kong, just even cities like Madrid and Paris, Berlin, cities which are great to live in, have very high densities. So yeah, this is a very current conversation in the UK as well, because we like our sort of, you know, 2 up, 2 down terraced house.
Yes, it seems to me, and we chatted before about it, that a timber building seems to be a very easy sell to me. You know, I think humans have a great affinity with timber, and sometimes I think that the word density is a really scary word, no matter how you say it, especially if it's coming. So the thing is, so Kylie, with your timber building, did you find it was quite an easy sell to the community, or did you find there was a lot of education to get across the line?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. The first building we built was in Melbourne, and we were really testing it. It didn't seem, at that point several years ago, it didn't drive a sales outcome.
Right.
And we were using it as a test for a construction methodology. We've built, we've just completed a commercial timber building, and it had a significant impact positive on leasing and sales of that building, as we're about to launch one in Brisbane at the moment. Now, our next residential projects, we think it will be very positive. Okay,
excellent. Yes, sir. There's a gentleman down the front.
Jeff Robinson from Oregon.
G'day, Jeff.
I'd like the panel members just to, I'm interested to see whether you reckon there is bipartisan support amongst the various political parties around solutions around density. Because I think the point that Penny was making so strongly is that has to happen. Otherwise, if we're starting to play games with each other, people really will fear what is being taken away rather than understanding how you can make things better. And I would just be interested in getting the various views of the people on the panel as to whether they think that there is a unified purpose around this, or are people playing games?
Who would like to take that? Michael?
Well, I wonder if Penny might start, but
I can. There we go. I think that the Greater Sydney Commission and the bipartisan support that received was really important. I think, as you know, the density that's being planned for the city really, as the point I was trying to, was making, has a lot of community resistance to it, and I think that there really is a need to. For elected representatives to acknowledge that density has to come. We can't just keep building at the margins. It's actually not sustainable, and it's not going to deliver any of the outcomes. And the speakers here have been able to articulate that very well. So I think that I feel like that there's bipartisan support around the Greater Sydney Commission, but I do think at a local level, at local government, there is not. And I think that there are lots of games. But I do think that there is a greater need for people for us to talk about what density can deliver, and I think the experience is there. I think one of the big issues we have with communities is that the people who oppose it don't live in high density and have generally not lived in high density, so they don't actually know. And I think there is an issue around pointing to really density done well. Central Park, I would use an example. I spent a lot of time door knocking around Chippendale, and a lot of the locals there don't like that, even though it's considered world leading and amazing. They don't like it because it's shaded half the day, and they feel that there was too much put on there. So there's serious problems, but I'm positive about where we're at in Sydney.
I think the question assumes that there's something which is sufficiently definable to get consensus around it. And as I said before, I think there are lots of different types of density which will be appropriate in different parts of the city. I agree with Penny, there is bipartisan support around the work of the Greater Sydney Commission and some of the things it's talking about doing, which is increasing job density west of Parramatta, for example. I think where it will become hard is holding political consensus around some of the major transport projects which are going to be required to enable density. And that may not be the difficult consensus that we would traditionally see where Conservative and Labor parties don't agree with each other about what the priorities should be. It may well come down to a dispute between the priorities for the city or cities in a state and the regions. And what we're seeing in Australian politics at the moment is the regions grabbing greater relevance for themselves because of who they're electing to Parliament and the force they're imposing on politics. And if we end up in a situation where really important transport choices for Sydney, which will enable density, get stymied because of an election result in Orange, or people switching parties in some outer region of some state, that's, I think, the larger political risk for us.
A question from SMS. This is for you, Mark. How do you improve design density quality and the sustainability performance while maintaining affordability and preventing costs being passed to homeowners? There's an easy one for you, mate.
Yeah. No, look, it is easy because, sustainability is something that we've embedded in everything we do, and we absolutely embrace what the Green Building Council is doing and neighbours and events like this. And I say that, and I say it's easy because over the last decade we've saved about $65 million. As our solar projects have acceptable internal rates of return, our water conservation projects have the same. Building, sustainably, and whether it's in cross-laminated timber or steel or traditional, is all about just how well you seal the building and how well you apply, good solid principles, I think, of things like solar orientation and acoustics, which all contribute to livability and ultimately customer acceptability. So ultimately, I can't imagine that anybody really wants to do it any differently into the future, and I see that pretty much in all of the larger companies. I think somehow when we see facades catching on fire in Melbourne, and I don't know if it's true, someone told me 40% of new constructions got that material in it. How on earth we can let that happen, with our building standards is beyond me. And clearly things like that break trust, right? And it's a really bad design outcome. It's a really bad thing from a health and safety point of view. And it's that stuff that I think we all have to stamp out and change this narrative. You've heard it from everyone, if we can't convince the broader community that we can do things really well for the benefit of everybody, because there is a real circular reference in this, then everything will go so much slower, and I think that's the biggest issue.